Canada to be presenting with our colleagues at BMS and to partner with Charity Village on this series, and it's terrific to be connected to all of you around the country. For those of you who aren't familiar with Volunteer Canada, we provide national leadership and expertise on volunteer engagement, and we work with over 220 local volunteer centres around the country, many of whom provide leadership in their communities around board development, volunteer engagement, and so on. Our interest in this topic stems from some work we were doing over 20 years ago when we became aware of the fact that many nonprofits were having challenges recruiting board members, and the challenges had to do with the concerns that prospective board members had about the risks that they were taking. The second part of it was that many nonprofits weren't aware of the risks and how to mitigate the risks. And we're also concerned about the affordability of directors and officers' liability insurance. So with that, we moved forward with a program that had two components. One was to create the program under our wing, which provided affordable insurance. But the second, and as important, was to create tools and resources for organizations on how to mitigate risks through practices and templates and policies to really make quality and safe programs through organizations. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues and we'll get started.
Good afternoon. My name is Mona Wakeham, and I'm the Eastern Regional Manager for Great American Insurance Company. I'm a D&O underwriter and have been involved with this line of coverage for about 20 years in Canada.
And I'm Alison O'Rourke from BMS Canada Risk Services. I'm a portfolio manager there, and we're the broker for the Under Our Wing program with Volunteer Canada.
And I'm Alex, and I'm an associate account manager with BMS, and I work very closely on the Under Our Wing insurance program.
Fantastic. Great. Excellent. So to get things started, we want many nonprofits wonder, do we really need insurance?
I'll just start off by welcoming everybody and thanking them for joining us today. BMS has worked with Volunteer Canada as the broker for the Under Our Wing program for several years, and we're delighted to be here with Mona and Paula today. At the moment, there are over 800 organizations across Canada participating in the Under Our Wing program, and most of our webinar today, as Paula mentioned, is going to focus on the risks facing directors and officers and how D&O liability insurance responds to them. However, there are other exposures facing nonprofits, and we'll touch on a few of those, but discuss them in less detail. As Marina said, we're happy to take any questions at the end, and our contact details can be found on the final slide. So please feel free to reach out to us to discuss further. I know, as Marina said, it's a short Q&A session, so drop us an email or give us a call after the session is over, and we'll happily take any of your questions then as well. So moving on, as nonprofits, do you really need insurance? The answer is yes, in short. Nonprofit boards can be sued by donors, employees, so prospective, current, or former employees, the general public, third parties, clients, and or government agencies. Claims against directors and officers can be both costly and disruptive, and even worse, if found guilty of misconduct, the personal assets of the individual board members could be at stake. The bylaws of the nonprofit may indemnify the board member, but that doesn't guarantee that the entity has the resources to fund the cost of a claim. And directors and officers' lawsuits can have devastating impact on the operating budget of a nonprofit organization, even putting the entity out of business. Directors and officers' claims are not covered by a general liability policy or any other policy form. And directors of nonprofits really have the same fiduciary duties as corporate board members. Nonprofit directors and officers' lawsuits can involve a variety of issues relating to the daily operations of the board, including duty of care, requiring the directors and officers to act prudently and reasonably in regard to the management of the organization's affairs, the duty of loyalty. This prohibits directors and officers from using their position in the organization to further any of their own personal interests, as well as duty of obedience. So this requires directors and officers to ensure that the organization is run in accordance with its charter and bylaws, and that the organization complies with applicable laws.
Fantastic, thank you. One of the things we often deal with at Volunteer Canada is that many nonprofits that involve volunteers wonder if they may be exempt. And one of the things that's interesting is that when you think about an organization, it is responsible for anything done in its name, whether by a paid employee, student, or volunteer. The flip side to that is an organization is also responsible for providing a safe and harassment-free workplace for all those, including paid employees, volunteers, and students. So it's a really interesting way to think of ourselves as both employers and service providers. So now that we've had an overview of what directors and officers liability insurance would cover, what are the types of insurance should organizations be considering?
So as Alison kind of indicated, I mean, this presentation is going to be kind of more heavily axed on the directors and officers side of the coverage, but it's important to take note of the other policies and types of coverage that are available to nonprofit organizations for risk transfer. So on this slide, we've included just a short laundry list of some items or some different types of coverage that you may want to ask your broker about or to ask us about that may be of interest to your organization. And also one item that's not included on that slide would be errors and omissions coverage. So if your organization is providing any kind of professional service, as an example, you would want to look into errors and omissions coverage. Travel insurance, if your organization is providing services overseas. Volunteer accident coverage, if you want to ensure that your volunteers have access to coverage in the case they're injured in performing their duties. So yeah, we've basically just included this laundry list. Again, we'll touch on some of these throughout the presentation, but just to kind of get everyone thinking about just outside of directors and officers is not the only coverage for organizations, but there are other lines of coverage as well.
So I know there's a range of organizations, small, large, offering all kinds of programs and services on their premises, off their premises. How does an organization figure out what they need?
Sure. I think the first step really is to look at your organization and its activities and operations, so you can get a clear picture of what your exposures are. So what are you doing? What is everybody doing that works there on a daily basis? You can ask yourself the following questions. Do you have a board of directors? Do you have premises? Do you host events or fundraising activities? Do your volunteers work off-site? Does your executive director do any travel overseas? All of the answers to all these questions will sort of drive which coverages you really need to put in place. And then it's important to take an inventory of your current insurance coverage. So what policies have you currently got in place? Chances are you probably have a property policy for your premises and your contents. Commercial general liability, that's another one that you might have. But do you have D&O? As Alex mentioned, in errors and omissions, are you providing any professional services? Those types of things are important to look at. Special events, the cyber coverage. Again, these two are sort of emerging risks, particularly cyber, that we'll talk about in more detail later. It's important that you engage your broker in discussions and ensure that the coverage that you have matches up to your exposures. And there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer in terms of who should be buying what coverage. Cost and risk management philosophies come into play here as well. But again, it's just look at your activities, what everyone's doing on a daily basis, and make sure that the insurance coverage is in place to match up with that.
Sounds great, Alison. One of the things that we often get questions about at Volunteer Canada is how do we know how much insurance to get? How do you calculate that?
So that's a very good question, Paula. I mean, there's no kind of one-size-fits-all answer to how much insurance coverage you should be buying. I mean, there's a number of different policies that are available to organizations, and there's any number of limits. So for directors and officers coverage, for example, you could get limits ranging from $500,000 in the aggregate to $25 million. And so kind of tying back to what Alison was saying on assessing your coverage needs, you really need to take account of your organization, your operations, requirements. For example, if you've applied for funding and there are certain requirements for that you must carry out, $5 million commercial general liability coverage. Those are things to take into account as well. And I mean, fundamentally, insurance is a risk transfer. So you're paying a premium to have coverage in the event that a claim made against you that falls within that policy is covered, right? So if your organization, let's say, may not necessarily have the budget to purchase a certain type of coverage for a risk that might be minimal to your organization, well, you may just kind of absorb that risk rather than then transfer that. So, I mean, getting back to what limit should you purchase, you just really need to have a conversation with your broker. It's about, what are your requirements? What's your budget for insurance, and what limit do you really feel comfortable in carrying?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And on the commercial general liability side, some venues, if you're holding events at certain venues, they might ask for your proof of commercial general liability. That's not uncommon, and they might, and so they might require you to have at least $2 million. So that's something else to consider. And then for the cyber, which again we'll talk about a little more later, that the limit you purchase for that type of policy might depend on the amount of personal data that you're collecting and storing on behalf of your employees and members and donors, etc.
I think so. Another thing that can be unsettling is when you start to get quotations from different brokers, and they're so different, and it's hard to determine and weigh them against your needs. What do you suggest we do to figure out what kind of, how to move forward and to assess those different quotations?
Absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of different D&O products and policies out there, some offering really kind of bare bones coverage for a discounted premium. It's important to get down to the nitty-gritty and really look at the coverage you're getting in conjunction with your broker. Some of the key features of D&O liability policies typically include you'd want a broad definition of insured, so to make sure that every person involved in your organization is covered, including the organization name itself. So the D&O liability policy should cover the directors, the officers, clearly, employees, including staff, volunteers, and committee members. And I mentioned as well, you want coverage for the organization itself, which brings me to the next point, which is the full entity coverage. So most policies would include coverage for claims made against the organization itself, even if no directors and officers are named if the organization is named. Third point, employment practices liability coverage, and we'll speak about that in a little more detail, but this typically forms part of the D&O policy, and it helps protect all the insured persons in the organization against against damages from claims for wrongful termination, sexual harassment, discrimination, unfair hiring or firing practices. And within the EPL section of the policy, you would look for covered perils. So that those items that I listed above, make sure that's a comprehensive list. The definition of loss in order to determine what damages are covered or excluded. Look what constitutes an actual claim and whether the policy is duty to defend or on a reimbursement basis. Leading us to the next point, which is duty to defend. And so this is important, as it means that if you have to defend yourself against a claim, you wouldn't want to have to cover the legal costs and be out of pocket, waiting to be reimbursed by the insurer. So a duty to defend policy is going to cover the costs up front. And we also want to make sure that the defense costs are outside the limit of liability. If defense costs are in addition to the limit, which means that these expenses do not diminish the overall limit of liability of the policy. Also prior acts coverage, so make sure that there's no retroactive date for the policy that would limit coverage for any prior wrongful acts, and reputational damage from a claim. So as you're probably aware, I mean, any allegations, even if unfounded, against a nonprofit can be extraordinarily damaging to their reputation in the community and can also affect perhaps their ability to provide services. With this coverage, insurers would cover the costs and expenses incurred to reduce reputational damage suffered by the insured, and that would maybe involve a cost to bring a public relations firm on board to do some damage control. And then finally, there's legal expense insurance and access to a legal advice helpline. I mean, this is something that is unique, fairly unique to the Volunteer Canada program, and this offers access to comprehensive legal expense insurance for offering protection against unexpected legal costs and allowing you to defend or pursue legal action, as well as access to a free telephone legal advice hotline where you can get advice on a variety of legal issues, including those that may not be covered under the policy. You'll have the opportunity to access a lawyer. The D&O policy available through the Under Our Wing program ticks all these boxes. It's comprehensive coverage. Volunteer Canada really have done the due diligence on behalf of their members. They've vested interest in providing a market-leading product that will protect them effectively.
Thanks, Allison. And I know in particular the legal advice hotline is something that our members really appreciate, because that can be intimidating when we're not sure. We always want to do the right thing morally and ethically, and we also want to know what is the right thing legally. So that's been really well received by our members for sure. So we've talked about coverage and what is available and what to look for in D&O and directors of an officer's policy. But how do I know if I have the right coverage in place?
Sure. Well, and as we said several times already, the best thing to do is to investigate what programs are out there and to engage with your broker. discuss what coverage is available. They can help you sort of assess your needs and your appetite. Do an audit of your current coverage, comparing it with your exposures and activities, as I mentioned before. And we'd also suggest reevaluating your coverage every few years. The scope of your activities might change, as well as your revenues. They could increase, which means you might require higher limits, that type of thing. So just to sort of keep that in mind.
Thank you. So this is the area that some of us don't like to think about but need to hear about. What kinds of risks are there? What kinds of claims do you deal with? Because you get to hear the inside out of our organization.
Right. I'll start. There's a Mona out. Feel free to jump in as you wish. Really, you know, the main ones are claims resulting from board or managerial decisions that have adverse financial consequences. So this is where your D&O policy would respond. Providing coverage for the organizations, its trustees, directors, and officers who could be exposed to financial loss. I'll give a couple of examples because sometimes that helps to illustrate exactly what the coverage can do. So the board of directors of a church could be sued by a number of their donors, alleging misrepresentation of the financial status of the organization. In this case, 3 members brought separate suits for repayment of the money that they lent to the church. Another example, an organization filed a suit against a foundation and its board of directors for improperly infringing upon the claimant's intellectual property rights. So these sort of speak to, and I mentioned earlier about duty of care. So where the directors and the officers have you know, a responsibility to act prudently and reasonably in regard to the management of the organization's affairs. The next type of claim, which is really the most common type of claim, which Mona will speak to a little bit further on in our presentation, are claims related to employment practices. So D&O policies can provide coverage for incidents such as harassment, including sexual and verbal, failure to hire, failure to promote, wrongful dismissal, and workplace bullying. And you know, sadly, these are the most common things we see involving volunteers, employees, etc. One example is after 10 years of employment, an employee was fired for poor work performance. This employee brought a discrimination suit against their employer. The individual alleged lack of workplace accommodation and constructive discharge. And again, the costs involved with defending these claims and the ultimate settlement can be fairly high. Another example is an employee alleged that one of the directors sexually harassed her by unwanted physical contact, and this occurred multiple times. They went to mediation, and costs exceeded $20,000. And finally, a volunteer claimed the denial of a full-time position was due to her sex, race, and pregnant condition. She filed a lawsuit claiming discrimination, and again, costs were quite high. So that's employment practice liability. Next, we'll move on to the claims arising from bodily injury and property damage to a third party caused by your operations or premises. So the commercial general liability policy, as I said earlier, is one that you probably haven't already. We won't go in great detail. One example, so this is the slip and fall type claims that we would see. For example, there was a holiday parade in a major metropolitan city, and they're sued by a spectator after one of the volunteer performers tossed a free gift into the crowd, injuring the plaintiff. The direct damages could fall under the CGL policy. Next, there would be financial loss due to dishonesty, fraud, theft of money, or other property owned by the nonprofit. So a crime policy would address this risk. And then finally, the special event coverage. And this is where if you're hosting an event, as nonprofits often do, a conference perhaps, or your AGM or a fundraiser, and the special events coverage provides commercial general liability coverage for the host of the event for claims arising from any bodily injury and property damage caused to a third party during that particular event. So a local library was hosting a yard sale to raise money when a community member tripped on a set of golf clubs, breaking her ankle and resulting in some medical expenses. And there is one more, is the cyber policy, the cyber coverage. And this is something that, we've heard a lot about recently. Cyber's quite a buzzword, particularly in our industry, but I think everywhere. And this, the type of claim we'd see through a cyber claim would be a cyber breach is exposing confidential member, donor, or employee data. So most organizations collect this type of information. They hold this information, in their offices. And the cyber and privacy coverage would cover expenses related to legal defense and damages awarded to individuals whose private and personal information is compromised. So for example, an employee of a charity left an encrypted data tape in his backpack that was left in his car. the backpack was subsequently stolen from his car, and this data contained a 15-year history of names, addresses, and social insurance numbers of donors. So this is some pretty personal and sensitive information that could cause some damage were it to get out into the public domain.
Allison.
You're welcome.
So I think many of us are hearing about the risks and wondering on how they relate, to each of our organizations and the work we do. Can we hear some specific examples of claims, not just to give us a little bit of a better idea? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I touched on a few of those now. I think maybe I'll let Mona jump in and talk a little bit about the most common type of claim. What as the insurer, what sort of they see the most of. Is that okay, Mona?
That sounds good.
Absolutely. So in the nonprofit realm, a lot of what we see, and I would say north of 50% of our claims are employment-related claims. I can give you some specific examples of claims that we've responded to on our nonprofit form. One is a housing authority brought suit against its accountants, alleging that they had made errors in their performance of the financial statements, and that led to issues with loans that they had received for funding. There was also allegations of embezzlement and conversion of assets by an employee of the accounting firm, and we paid approximately $50,000 in that claim. Another claim is two former employees of a nonprofit social agency were fired and charged with theft for stealing from the agency. They were tried and eventually acquitted of the charges, and then they filed suit against the social agency for allegations of malicious prosecution. The case was settled, and we paid almost $300,000 on that claim. Another one is a former director of development for a nonprofit organization alleged sexual discrimination and breach of implied contract. And that one went to court, and in favor of the employee, there was a sum of $560,000. Cost to us was $450,000, so that was certainly a larger claim. We have a claim against a volunteer firefighter who is also a member of a local water association. He filed suit, regarding the, there's a typo in my, he lost his volunteer position, and there were allegations of libel and slander. We paid $32,000 in that case. I'll give maybe one more. A local animal cruelty society was sued by the municipality after the city decided to pull all of its funding and handle dog tag and related services through their own offices. The society was unable to reimburse the funds, and this resulted in litigation, and we paid almost $100,000 on that claim. So those are some examples. Other things that we see in the nonprofit world is when there are employees and the nonprofit becomes insolvent and unable to pay unpaid wages and taxes owed to the government, the directors can be personally liable. One of our largest claims actually ongoing in Canada is involving an insolvency situation.
That sounds great.
Great. Thanks, Mona.
You're welcome.
So what about the special events insurance coverage you mentioned earlier? Why is this important, and what types of claims can come out of these?
So special events coverage is obviously important for nonprofits. A lot of operations can be axed or centered around hosting special events and putting on galas for your volunteers or hosting fundraisers. And so it's very important to take into consideration exposures that you might have in hosting an event. I mean, is there alcohol being served? Do you have a commercial general liability policy that's already covered or that already covers your events? So it's important to kind of have that at the back of your mind when you're looking to host an event. And also, I mean, if you're renting a hall, for example, it's virtually certain that hall will request that you have a certain limit of liability coverage, so whether that's $1, $2, or $5 million in commercial general liability insurance. And special events insurance is really just kind of it's an extension of commercial general liability coverage. So that's at the base of it, it's coverage for bodily injury or property damage to a third party. So let's say you have an event and somebody walks in, slips and falls, right? Decides to sue you. Just kind of the most basic commercial general liability example you have. Or as was kind of on one of the earlier slides, damage to the venue, where the specific example was you left a tap running over the weekend, it caused water damage to surrounding units, and your organization is liable for that. Well, it's kind of the same scenario in a special event. Like if you accidentally start a fire over the course of your event, which hopefully never happens, but if it does, that's something that's going to be covered by your special events or commercial general liability policy. And also one thing that you might also want to consider if you're hosting a special event outside of just this special event insurance is event cancellation coverage, which can sometimes be coupled with commercial general liability or, again, your more specific event policy, which is if, as an example, your event needs to be canceled because of inclement weather. Well, that policy would serve to reimburse you for expenses incurred, and I mean any fees, let's say, that were guaranteed to vendors, that would kind of be paid out of the event cancellation. So that's also an important piece of coverage to consider. But again, it's all dependent on your needs. I mean, how big is your event? If it's canceled, would your organization be able to just absorb that financial loss, or do you want to pay that additional premium to get that event cancellation coverage? And so yeah, that's kind of just a basic overview of the special events coverage. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
That's great. Thanks, Alex. Cyber seems to be a hot topic these days. What does this coverage entail?
Yeah, so I mean, I think as Allison had mentioned, cyber is a buzzword these days. I mean, you see it all over the news. I mean, if it's not Home Depot, it's Sony or whatever that's being that's having their electronic database or just their network compromised. And I mean, as a nonprofit, obviously depending on the size of your nonprofit, you must be wondering, well, how can I protect myself when there's these large multinationals with billions of dollars in assets, huge teams of people, tens of thousands of employees? Well, how can my nonprofit protect ourselves? What can we do? What's out there? What's available? And I mean, one of the big things that we're seeing with cyber risks is that they're indiscriminate. Like the recent ransomware attacks, people just clicking on a link in an email that then encrypts, your servers, your computer, depending on how you have things structured. And you're not going to be able to break that encryption, so you're either going to have to pay that ransom or you're going to have to recover that data, replace it. And I mean, being subject to a cyber attack raises a lot of privacy issues as well. So I know on a previous slide we had mentioned an example about, let's say, you have a database of donors. So you have some fairly detailed, personally identifiable information on that in that database. Well, if that's breached, and there's a potential that that information is out there in the cyberspace, and there's a number of different steps that your organization is going to have to take to address that breach. And it can be a significant exposure for your organization. I mean, you'll have to report that as a breach. There may be an investigation into the breach and kind of remediation efforts. You may have to call, mail, or take a number of different steps to kind of mitigate the effects of that private information being released. You could potentially be sued for that breach of privacy, and obviously settlements that go along with that. So cyber exposure is definitely not just a threat, again, for these large multinationals. It's also something to take into consideration as a nonprofit. And so just tying that back into kind of the program and the coverage that we've arranged with Volunteer Canada, the policy, the directors and officers policy that we offer includes an extension to address these cyber risks and the exposures associated with those risks. So definitely something to look into. Do you already have that? And what is your, do you already have a coverage extension that covers that? Do you have a separate policy? And what is your exposure? I mean, do you have staff that are taking portable USB sticks or hard drives with them? Are they encrypted or are they only password protected? And I mean, taking kind of steps to address the management of your data and get kind of some solid controls around that. So yeah, that's kind of what we've got on the cyber.
Thank you. And I'm glad you addressed the fact that it goes hand in hand, protecting yourself with insurance, but also protecting yourself with measures to prevent. And I think that's one of the key things to the partnership that we have together, is that we're looking at both.
Absolutely.
Great. Can you give us a few more examples of directors and officers liability insurance claims?
Sure. I mean, I won't go into too much detail, but just a few to kind of bring the point home. And again, we're happy to communicate with you after the webinar and talk these through further. But things like an employer's failure to supervise an employee's use of funds. Professional association could be sued for revoking membership. Wrongful dismissal is alleged sexual misconduct, this falling under the EPL section of the policy we talked about earlier. Again, with this one, nonprofit entity could be sued by a client for discrimination. Perhaps a service club is sued by a member, again, revoking the membership, so wanting some clarity around that. Wrongful dismissal action, alleging defamation. Perhaps the government would sue a nonprofit organization for alleged misuse of funds. And we've also seen licensing disputes resulting in lawsuits against professional associations. So there are many examples, and we're happy to provide more to illustrate how the coverage works in more detail.
So getting to what we were talking about earlier about prevention going hand in hand, what are some of the steps that nonprofits can take to mitigate risk?
Sure. Mona, do you want to jump in?
Sure. An appropriate risk management program to look at their exposure. So I think that's been discussed a little bit, really looking at what the operations are to ensure that the appropriate insurance is in place. Having D&O insurance in place to attract high quality and experienced directors is important. Oftentimes people won't sit on the board if there isn't a policy in place and they're not comfortable with the policy. With respect to employment matters, oftentimes, nonprofits, like any other organization, have to downsize. They need to take action against an employee. So in those cases, it's often very important to consult with outside legal counsel, if at all possible, to ensure that you're giving appropriate notice and pay in lieu of notice. What seems to be maybe very logical might not necessarily be what's required by law, and oftentimes that's where we see the claims coming from.
And I guess probably important to have, a robust HR handbook that sort of outlines these policies and procedures, making, transparency with your employees. I mean, this is how certain things are handled, and having that kind of reviewed by legal and making sure your ducks are in a row with that type of information for your employees.
Absolutely, and also documenting things. Sometimes we had a claim not that long ago that actually became quite large. The nonprofit did everything right. It had to do with pension benefits, and they went to the administrator of the pension, which was a very large, sophisticated organization, and they asked for guidance. And they then went back to the employee and communicated, and something went awry, and it could have been miscommunication, it could have been incorrect information from the pension administrator, but at the end of the day, the employee was harmed. His pension had amounts weren't what they should be, so he filed suit, and there was no documentation to show that the nonprofit had gone to the pension administrator and gotten the advice that they had given the employee. So in the end, it was expensive to defend, and there was no clarity because nothing was written down. So that was a six-figure claim for us. So it's important to write stuff down, to keep proper board minutes at all directors meetings, board of director meetings. If somebody dissents, you know, make note of it. Things like that are very important.
Great, thank you. And I should also say that through Volunteer Canada's Under Our Wing program, there are tools and resources available that are specifically relating to insurance and to risk. There are some articles that focus on new and emerging risks, like the cyber article, which I believe we showed a snapshot of on the previous slide, and that is all available via the Volunteer Canada website. And we're constantly kind of producing new material, you know, open to any suggestions from members too, and things that we can look into and provide some advice on. We're more than happy to.
That's terrific. Thank you, Alison, Alex, and Mona. One of the things we always like to emphasize at Volunteer Canada, I know the term duty of care was referred to a number of times, and even though it is a legal term, that a board of directors has a duty of care to all those involved in the organization, we also consider it to be an ethical term. So aside from efforts we want to make through mitigating risk and through insuring ourselves, we don't want to we're not carrying these out only to prevent and deal with potential lawsuits. We're taking these measures because we believe they are the right thing to do to protect those and to provide safe and quality programs and services. And so it's really important that we think about it in that context, that we're not simply taking measures to avoid being sued and to protect ourselves and to transfer risk, although that's part of the program, but it's also really important to really keep ourselves centered in why we're doing the work and important work we're doing in communities, and that we do want to carry out our work in a responsible way that is safe and caring and in sync with our values. So I wanted to end with that. Great. And we'll entertain any questions people have.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, you know, as we've outlined, there are many risks facing nonprofits, but the most important thing really is to be aware of them and to understand that there is insurance coverage available to transfer this risk. And, you know, insurance can be confusing, but that's why we're here, and we're happy to take any questions. And, yeah, we'll open up to that.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for a ton of information there. And we do have quite a few questions coming in from our participants. So I will just remind everyone that if you have a question for one of our presenters today, please do type it into the question box, and we will do what we can to get to it. So let's start off with a common question that we've had. Can you talk a little bit about risk involved with events that might include serving alcohol?
Great question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, any event really that includes.
Sorry, Alex, we lost audio for a moment there. Would you mind just repeating yourself?
Yeah, no, sorry. I was just saying that I'll just use like a year-end gala, let's say, as an example. But really, I mean, obviously, it applies to any event using or serve where there's alcohol being served. An exposure for organizations. Obviously, it's a huge exposure. I mean, somebody has a drink at the event or a few drinks, and they drive home, and there's an accident, right? That will ultimately fall back on, obviously, the person that was drink driving, but also, I mean, where they were being served. So there's a potential liability there. So things your organization needs to take into account is, okay, well, are we serving the alcohol? Are we, do we have people who are smart served? I mean, what kind of procedures do we have around that? Or is it just easiest for us, rather than kind of organizing that and absorbing that, is it better to have the venue or a third party who kind of does this, like a caterer, let's say, as an example, to have them provide the alcohol, accept that liability, and serve at our gala. And so the policy that we offer through the Under Our Wing Volunteer Canada VMS insurance program includes coverage for that liquor liability. So if you are serving alcohol, we can provide you with coverage in the event that something goes awry, and there is a claim arising from alcohol being served at your event. So you need to make sure that, again, you just need to have risk management protocols around that, have the appropriate vendors in place if you're not doing it yourself, which I wouldn't really advise. I would advise probably to have a third party doing that. Do they have insurance? It's always prudent to check if that vendor has coverage. And then, yeah, just ensuring that you ask your broker those questions, ask to see the policy wordings, throw some scenarios at them and say, hey, if this happened, would we have coverage? Because oftentimes, I mean, you might find that you might be being offered the cheapest rate, and we kind of alluded to that in previous slides, but it might not be the appropriate coverage. So it's important to kind of ask those questions and go through that exercise, particularly where alcohol is involved.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and also for special event coverage, if the event is being held actually at the nonprofit's place of doing business and not at a special venue, do you still recommend the special event coverage?
So generally, no, but again, it all depends, because if it's being hosted on the premises for that nonprofit, well, it's probably going to be like, let's say they have a small office and they're bringing in, I don't know, they're having a board meeting. Well, that's not a special event. If your organization has a commercial general liability policy and you're having a meeting on premises, that should be included in like the commercial general liability policy or office package that your organization has. However, if you are hosting an event on your premises, and let's say your office is a bit larger, and you're going to have members of the general public coming in and there's going to be alcohol being served, you may want to ask your broker and say, hey, you know what, this event is a bit outside of what we normally do. You know, there's alcohol being served. Should we, like, will this be covered under our commercial general liability? Do we have coverage for that alcohol exposure? Or should we look at getting just a special events extension for this one event? So again, it's like with a lot of these questions, it's hard to give like a one-size-fits-all answer, just because there isn't one. It really boils down to your organization, your kind of operations, what you're doing, and just really asking those questions, going to your broker. I mean, that's what they get paid for, is to answer these questions and to help you kind of get the appropriate coverage to address these risks. So yeah, that would be my answer to that.
Okay, and for organizations that are running a variety of different programs, do they normally get coverage through the organization itself, or does each program need to be looking at special coverage that's unique to them?
Yeah, I mean, the organization itself, I'm not sure if I understand what you mean by programs, but typically the organization itself would have the coverage in place for their board of directors and their activities and operations, and that would include if they're running several programs. Do you mean sort of courses, or if that's the intention? Yeah, it would all be covered under the organization's policy. They would be the name insured in the policy.
And if there was separate satellite offices, perhaps, how might that affect it?
It's really going to depend on kind of the structure of the organization, right? I mean, is it just one organization under the one legal entity operating at all these different locations across Canada, or is it an international organization? And I mean, where each national organization is completely independent from the international body. I mean, it's generally you would have one organization that would insure all its operations in Canada if it's one legal entity. I mean, and I know we get into this with some of our organizations where you have different chapters, right? So you may have like a head branch or a main chapter, but you may have kind of chapters across the country that operate, I mean, relatively independently. I mean, they may not be incorporated separately or registered as a charity separately, but they may have their own boards of directors. They may have separate bylaws. And again, this goes back to kind of the one-size-fits-all thing. It's about discussing it with your broker. I know in our program, we've had this case where we've had organizations that have different chapters, and again, separate boards of directors, but by kind of aggregating a policy and just having one policy for all organizations, all chapters, I mean, it's more cost-effective that way. But then again, you run into issues of, well, some chapters may want to be kind of more independent and continue along that vein. So yeah, I mean, it really boils down to
yeah, there are different structures.
Exactly.
We've seen both, and yeah, we have certainly put both types of structures in place.
Yeah.
Okay, and shifting gears a little bit, so if we, sort of leave the larger organizations, what if we talking about a very small organization that maybe has no staff at all? Would they still need to consider insurance?
Interestingly enough, 54% of all nonprofit organizations in Canada have no paid staff. Yet, they are still absolutely responsible for any program that they deliver and anyone that they involve. So that's one of the things where you always want to, of course, scale the coverage, according to, as my colleagues have said. But just because you're all volunteer run and you're small, usually does not mean that you aren't undertaking risks.
That's right. And I mean, low limits are available for reasonable costs. So it's not, the cost doesn't have to be prohibitive just because you're a smaller organization. That the program definitely takes that into account.
Great. And does the coverage change when you're sort of moving across Canada from province to province, or is it more of a national thing? And specifically, we had a question asked about if the coverage is different in Quebec.
So yeah, I mean, the coverage is in Quebec. There is just off the top of my head here, I'd have to check my notes, but I believe it's for the defense costs are required to be outside the limit of coverage, which is already included in our policy. But maybe Mona, you can speak to that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, you're correct, and that's Quebec Civil Code. That's a requirement by law. In terms of our policy, is the D&O policy is what I can speak to is a global policy. So irrespective of where the activities are, sometimes there's laws that are different by province, and that manifests more in how a claim is brought and under what laws. But the actual coverage itself is oftentimes, other than the defense piece that Alex just spoke about, is essentially the same.
Great, and we had a couple of questions. I think this was just maybe missed when we were going through the initial part of the presentation, but with regards to the D&O coverage, we had a couple of people asking if you could just clarify, does this also cover staff and volunteers?
Yes, it does. That's correct.
Great. So
and again, that's speaking to the policy that we offer. We can't speak to all policies. This is what we offer with volunteers, like through the Under Our Wing program. That our policy does include.
Correct. It's a broad definition of insured that does include staff and volunteers.
Yeah.
Great. And maybe Paula, perhaps you could speak a little bit to why Volunteer Canada chose the Under Our Wing policy to partner with.
So we created the program in response to our member agencies really asking for help, about three things. One is understanding and demystifying what insurance is all about and what they needed. Second of all, making it affordable. And third of all, really going hand in hand with these programs is partnering with BMS and through our Under Our Wing really speaks to the resources and tools and training and education that we promote so that you are really building safer programs in addition to mitigating risk through insurance. So it really is much more comprehensive, and that's our philosophy, that it's about protecting volunteers, it's about protecting organizations that are members of Volunteer Canada who engage volunteers.
Wonderful. Okay, so we've got some additional questions coming in, so we're just going to keep going here. The new, fairly new anti-spam legislation, is there coverage under the policy for that?
So yeah, under the Directors and Officers policy, I mean, I need to check the exact wording, but the extension for the cyber extension is called. There is some coverage for castle complaints. So obviously you should try to avoid having a complaint made against you and kind of work within those new rules. But yeah, there is coverage in the event of a castle infraction.
Okay, and we've talked a bit about director liability. are past board members generally, can they be held liable, like if they've, say, not been with the organization for a few years?
Yes, they can. If a claim were to arise after they've left there, yes, there is a period of time where the coverage would still be provided for activities of a past board member.
And on that as well, just to kind of elaborate a little bit, if your organization, for example, ceases operating, I mean, let's say your organization, I mean, there's maybe no longer anyone who wants to volunteer or work with the organization, or there's no funding available, so unfortunately the organization has to close down. It's important to look into extended reporting period coverage, because these directors and officers policies, and this is really specific to directors and officers coverage and the errors and omissions coverage as well, is that it's made on a claims made form. So what that means is that you need to have insurance when the claim is made, not when the incident actually occurred. So if your organization, let's say, is closing down August 1st, and that's it, there's no more operations, the entity has been folded, well, a claim can still be made against past directors and officers, the entity, for something that happened in the past. However, you need to have coverage at the time the claim is made. So that's where the extended reporting period coverage is important. It's basically coverage for, past services or actions, or basically past operations, sorry, of the organization while it was still operating, but it's just into the future for any claims that may arise from those operations. So I hope I made that clear, but it's really really important to make sure if your organization may be shutting down, that you look into that coverage to protect directors and officers into the future.
Wonderful. And what happens with the directors and officers insurance if the organization's operating globally? Does that make a difference?
No, Great American offer, this is a worldwide policy. However, there could be some local regulations with regard to locally admitted policies. So again, if that were the case and you were opening up an office overseas, we could look into those local regulations for you and advise. It could be that you would need to have a local policy, but again, that would be particular to certain countries. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Mona.
No, I agree. It is a global policy, but if you are operating outside of Canada, it's good to let your broker know, to let BMS know, and they can guide you as to whether or not there are local requirements in those areas that you operate. There's not a lot, but there are a few.
Wonderful. Well, we are coming close on time, so I just want to finish today by just exploring a little bit more about how the free legal advice option works.
Sure, absolutely. And that's something that's relatively unique to the Under Our Wing program, as far as I've come across, and that's offered through a third party, through a company called DAS. And the way that works is with your Volunteer Canada policy, you receive a telephone number which entitles you to call up and receive some free legal advice on, and as I said, any topic. It could even be something that's not covered under the policy, but just that you need some advice from a lawyer on. So I believe there's a set period of time where you can speak to this lawyer and get some advice. So it's valuable, and we get the stats from the legal expense insurer, and there's some good take up just to get advice about employment matters. I mean, anything really that comes along. I mean, the small nonprofits don't have their own legal team necessarily, so this is a really valuable resource for them, and it's used fairly frequently.
Mm-hmm. And the big thing I think too, as Allison mentioned, is that you can call as much as you want. You can call them up every day. Yeah. I mean, we suggest that you do take advantage of it. Yeah. I think for some organizations, I mean, I know some organizations may have a lawyer on the board who may kind of assist with legal matters, or they may not be comfortable assisting with legal matters as it relates to the board. So you can always give this legal advice hotline whenever, however much you want, and it's available to you.
That's a great benefit. That's wonderful. So now, just to finish off, perhaps anyone can jump in here, but we do have a ton of questions in the chat box, and I'm very sorry to those that we didn't get to your question today. But perhaps Paula, Allison, maybe you could just weigh in on if people do still have questions or they're interested in learning more about the Under Our Wing policy. What's next?
Sure, absolutely. Well, on that final slide are our contact details. We'll get back to you very quickly. Happy to talk anything through and see if we can help. With regard to the Under Our Wing program, there's details on the Volunteer Canada membership on the website under membership. There's some more details about the program. So yeah, feel free to reach out to either of us. We're more than happy to help. I know it can be kind of confusing, and yeah, I apologize too that we didn't get to all of your questions, but you know, happy to take them after the webinar and help where we can. So please, yeah, reach out.
Absolutely, and one of the things that we're working on together is a board kit, which we'll be launching in the next few months, which will have some really good information for board members on various aspects. We're also planning to collect some good samples of policies and templates that'll be of use. There's also the screening handbook on our website, which really is a good resource in terms of a lot of areas to mitigate risk, particularly for those organizations that work with vulnerable populations. So we're happy to find out anything you're looking for in terms of building your capacity and creating those safe and quality programs and services and mitigating risk at the same time.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank you again, Paula, Mona, Allison, Alex, all of you for joining us today for a very information-packed presentation. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank
you. Thank you all.
Now, it's been a great pleasure for us at Charity Village to partner with Volunteer Canada on this three-part summer webinar series that we've been doing, and I would like to extend our biggest thanks to the team at Volunteer Canada. They've put together some great content for our participants, and yeah, big shout out to them. So thanks, Paula, and your team. So just before we sign off today, I do want to remind everyone that we're following up with all of you by email tomorrow morning with the webinar recording. We will include a link to a very short survey there. If you can take a moment to fill that out, it's very helpful for us. It will help us further refine our content and delivery going forward. You'll have an opportunity there to let us know if there's other topics you'd like to see covered in a future session as well. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you again for joining us today. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.